I'm sorry, but I hate bebop scales. And if you're stuck playing solos that sound mechanical and boring, bebop scales only make it worse. Now luckily, Barry Harris has a simpler and more musical approach for adding bebop flow to your solos. His approach completely changed the game for me and is what I've used to help thousands of my students play solos with the right rhythms and chromatic phrases. So in this video, I'm gonna show you his method for adding those bebop rhythms and chromatic lines to your solo. So you don't just practice jazz, you actually sound like it. You might be wondering, do I really need to learn this? But bebop is incredibly important for learning jazz. Just listen to what Christian McBride says.
Let's make something very clear. Bebop language is still modern day language.
Most people think that nailing bebop is all about knowing the right scales and arpeggios. But here's the real problem. If you focus only on scales and arpeggios, your solos will still sound boring and lifeless, no matter how many notes you cram in there. Think of it like learning a language. You can memorize every word in the dictionary, but if you don't know how to put them together in a sentence, you'll never have a real conversation. In bebop, melody, rhythm, and flow are how you put words together and make your solos speak. So before you worry about which scale to use, let's look at how melody and flow actually create that magical bebop sound. Charlie Parker's solos completely blew my mind when I was first getting into jazz, especially his jazz blues solos, like this one on Casey Blues. Some of his phrases sounded just like the blues licks that I already loved from Albert King and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And then there were also these other melodies, and they were something else. They sounded amazing, but they weren't blues at all. I'd never heard anything like that, and I needed to figure out how to play like that. That curiosity is what pulled me deeper into jazz and eventually led me all the way to a degree in jazz performance at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague. The problem with bebop scales for me is that they put all the emphasis on just running up and down a scale. Take the G7 bebop scale, for example. Sure, you get all the chord tones light up on the beat and the stepwise melody spells out the chord, but let's be honest, when you play lines like this, it sounds mechanical. It's missing all the stuff that makes bebop exciting. You don't hear the twists, turns, and surprises that make bebop lines sound great. Something like this. That kind of magic just isn't built into the bebop scale approach. Music is about more than just putting chord tones on every downbeat. To me, this relates to something that we're still learning to teach. Pat Metheny talks about this in the Rick Beato interview.
Well, you know, melody of the three branches of musical government is the one that you can't go to college for 4 years on. You can definitely go to college for 4 years on harmony.
Yeah.
And you can definitely go to college for 4 years on rhythm. Melody, your theory teacher's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about lyrical this and leap, intervallic leaps that.
Metheny's point is one of the reasons that I love Barry Harris' approach. Barry doesn't just teach harmony, he teaches melody. Even if he doesn't have a fancy name for every concept, his method helps you actually create those flowing musical bebop lines. And that's what I'm going to be showing you throughout this video. So let's start with something incredibly simple, but absolutely essential for making your solo sound musical. One of the biggest things that I learned is that great melodies aren't stuck changing direction on the heavy beats like beat 1 and 3 all the time. This is about the rhythm of the melody, and you want to also change direction on the offbeats because that makes it lighter and more interesting. Check out how I'm essentially playing the same notes, but now I'm changing direction on 2-and and 4-and. Hear how much more alive that sounds? That's the rhythm in the melody, the thing that really gives it that bebop energy. But of course, this is not something that you can think about when you're playing, at least I can't. So you need a different approach to get it into your playing. And trust me, it's worth it. This is a huge part of the bebop sound. Now, this video is really about my favorite trick for bebop melodies, and I'll get to that soon. But first, let's start with a simple approach, using triads and enclosures. I'm using this on a G7, so start with a simple G major triad. Now here's where it gets really interesting. You can add a chromatic enclosure around each triad note by using a diatonic note above and a chromatic note below. So for the G, that means A above and F sharp below. And then of course you want to resolve that. And if you do that for the entire triad, you get this. This is not yet super exciting, but check this out. Now you've got a line that doesn't just move in one direction and it still fits the chord perfectly. Compare how much more interesting this is to just running up and down a scale. Here's the secret. When your melody moves down, try playing the enclosure in the opposite direction. So if I'm going down from G to F to D, now instead of landing straight on the D, I flip the enclosure and I jump down to C sharp, so. And then of course back up to E before resolving to the D. And if you play this in time, you get this. So even though the melody is moving down, the enclosure moves up, making the line jump around and sound more alive. Now this isn't a strict rule, it's just a trick to make your lines less predictable and more musical. It takes a bit of practice to hear and play these melodies, but once you do, you'll start noticing them everywhere. For example, here's a Joe Pass line that I transposed to C major. I still remember this one because I used to mess it up all the time when practicing homework from the Joe Pass guitar style book. Now you can take any triad and figure out these enclosures, but don't just practice them in isolation. Try composing lines that use this flipped enclosure approach so that you really get the sound into your ear. Now I call them flipped enclosures because they move against the main melodic direction. I'm not sure that if there's a more official name for this. Now let's move to the first Barry Harris concept because it works in a similar way but with a lot more notes and even more bebop flavor. Let's take this a step further with one of Barry Harris' favorite bebop tricks, pivot arpeggios. Now you'll find these all over his teaching and solos, even if he doesn't always explain why they sound so good. In the previous example, I used an enclosure to change the direction of the melody. But now let's use an arpeggio to do the same thing. So start with a basic C major 7 arpeggio. Now you turn that into a pivot arpeggio by moving the first note, the C, up an octave. And that gives you that beautiful interval leap that still sounds very melodic. And this instantly makes your lines jump around in a way that sounds way more interesting and bebop. Just listen to Grant Green, he does this all the time. Here's one of his phrases from the end of the bridge on I Remember April. Now let's bring this back to our G7 example. If you use the arpeggio built on the 7th of that chord, so the F, you get an F major 7 and you get a line that skips around but still fits perfectly. In this line I'm also using another Barry Harris trick that is super powerful, but for now just try writing your own lines with pivot arpeggios to get that sound into your ears and your playing. Now if you listen closely to the second half of the bar, then the melody moves down but then moves back up to the D on beat 4. This gives you another beautiful interval skip without making the line sound angular or awkward. And that's actually a Barry Harris half-step move coming straight out of his chromatic scale concept. So let's explore that next. It's a great shortcut to the sound of bebop. I know it might sound strange that I'm calling D a half-step between C and B in the C major scale, but that's exactly how Barry Harris chromatic scale works. And once you get it, it is an amazingly powerful tool for creating those classic bebop phrases. Let me show you how it works with a basic C major scale. Now Barry came up with a way to add a chromatic note between all the notes in the scale, but you need a clever trick to make this work. So of course, when we go from C to D, we can just use the C sharp, so same when I'm going from D to E. But between E and F, there's no note in between. So what you do is you take the scale note above the F. Now F up to G, we still have an F sharp, so. And G to A is the same thing. And also A to B. Between B and C, again, there's no note in between, so I take the scale note above the C. And now you have this scale. And the best part, it works going down as well as going up. There is an even cooler extension to this, I'll show you in a bit, but even just the basic chromatic scale is an incredible way to make your lines sound more fluid and bebop. For example, here's how I use it on a G7 chord, adding a half step between E and F and between C and B. So this is using Harris Chromatic scale right from the beginning. I'm starting on the F, adding the G in between the F and the E. So there we have that half step, that's a scale note above. Then a few regular passing notes down to the C. And again, here between the C and the B, I'm adding the D before continuing down to this chromatic run. These short chromatic connections and just skips around the scale are really what gives your lines that flowing, swinging bebop sound. When Barry Harris came to the conservatory in The Hague, he had us all play his chromatic scale exercise, but then he dropped a bombshell that I actually didn't really get at the time, and now I realize that it's one of the most powerful ways to create those supercharged bebop lines. Any note can be a half step. Now, why is this such a game changer? Because it means that you're not limited to using just one right passing note. You can use different notes to create bigger interval skips, and it still sounds great and keeps the flow going. Let's take the start of the previous example. So here I'm using the G as a half step between the F and the E. But check this out, you can actually also use the A. And that sounds just as good, and you can even drop down the A to the lower octave here, and then you get a huge interval skip, but it sounds even more amazing. And now you can mix things up even further by combining enclosures and the chromatic scale for a line like this. And remember that all of this is to avoid getting stuck playing solos that sound like this. But here's the wild part, there's actually another level to this, and things can get even crazier, and I'm gonna show you how in the next section. Now here's how you can take the Barry Harris half step idea and supercharge it even more. You already know how to add an interval skip as a half step, but you can actually add a chromatic leading note to that half step as well. And I know that sounds a bit crazy, but check this out. First, here's the basic Barry Harris half step. Now let's take the low A that we're using as a half step and add a chromatic note leading into it. So with this chromatically boosted half step, and that should not be the real name for this, you can create lines like this. But jazz is not only soloing, you also need to play chords, and comping is one of the most fun parts of jazz, but only if you don't get stuck memorizing chord voicings and inversions. Now luckily, Joe Pass has a very practical and efficient system for this. I break that down in this video so that you can start using his simple method to play beautiful comping and chord melody. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.